Hi, my name's Aaron. In the previous video, we took a look at a MongoDB app that was converted from Realm SDK for Atlas over to Couchbase Lite using Capella App Services. In this video, we're going to go through and do a code review of that application to get an understanding of what code was changed. Let's get started. Let's talk about what changes were required in the application to make this happen. So I'm going to click the stop button here. And we're gonna go look at some code real quick. Okay, so the first thing to obviously talk about is that I had to make some changes to the Gradle script, okay? And that's because we're no longer using the Realm package and we're using Couchbase Lite instead. So the very first thing is, and you can, all this stuff is available from the Couchbase docs, and I highly recommend bookmarking them. And if you're gonna go through the conversion process, it's gonna be your favorite place to go, is go to docs.couchbase.com. And from there, click on mobile. And since we're doing Android, we're going to go to Couchbase Lite and go to Android specifically. Okay. And if you go to the getting started documents, there's a whole thing around the prerequisites, but also the install documents. This is going to walk you through the Gradle file changes in great detail. I'm just going to quickly brush over the things I did from here. Okay. So one, Maven directory, you have to add Maven for the Couchbase server that hosts the packages. Okay. So when we build our Couchbase Lite plugin, we post them on our own Maven server. So you'll have to add that URL in. That's what that does, okay? You'll see here I've got it for both all projects in the current build script. You know, this is a little bit more complicated of an application, so I want to make sure that we're definitely using it in any part of the build process that builds, okay? The next thing that's going to happen here is that I actually made some changes to make sure that this is up to date with the latest version of Android. So if you do a diff, you're going to notice that like Android application was updated to 8.5.2. You'll see that the Kotlin version's running at the last version of 1.9 that I feel is compatible with Jetpack Compose in the version there. This was a conversion, not a, hey, let's get it running on the latest version of all the Android stuff, right? So in the world of converting apps, you have to limit your amount of tech debt, right? If you're going to say, I'm going to move off my database platform to a new database platform and update all my Android stuff, you're adding to the risk of having just massive amount of problems because you won't know, is it the database changes or all of Android packages I updated for the new version of Jetpack Compose. My recommendation is take one tech debt problem at a time. So instead, get yourself up to running with Couchbase Lite and then worry about your other tech debt of like, I need to update these other Jetpack Compose packages or Kotlin versions after that's done. So that you're limiting the amount of things that can go wrong for you, right? So that's the very first part. So in there, I changed that out. And then of course, inside of our other part of our Gradle app, so instead of the actual part of this, we have to go through and add in Couchbase Lite. So at some point in time, I went through the namespace here and said, hey, look, you know what? I'm going to change this from being Realm to Couchbase, which is perfectly fine. The target SDK, I kind of left what it was, min 28, max 23. I think I updated this to 33, excuse me, but it should be 34 in order to ship to the App Store today. I did not make that change. That's something that should happen. But when you do that, you're going to have to make some packages changes. And that's something I did not want to go through and have to deal with. So I just left that 33. And once again, limiting that tech debt, wait until after I get everything running and then worry about updating the target to be 34 if I'm shipping this thing to the App Store. You can see here we're using Java version 11, which is pretty popular. You can see here the namespace, I didn't change that out there. But if we look at our packages, you'll see many packages need to be updated. I did not take that tech debt in. Instead, at the very bottom, I just added Couchbase Lite 3.2.0, which is the latest version at the time of recording this video. So that's the very first change that I made, is basically just getting Couchbase Lite into the application and removing Realm. So the next thing I needed to do is I needed to talk about authentication. And authentication is an interesting topic inside of the current system. And if we go back to the diagram, this will probably make a little bit more sense here. So let me go back and to our repo here where we have this diagram to understand. In the original application, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. The application template app is the starting point of the application. Now Realm has an authentication framework built into it that handles authenticating into Realm and Atlas. Now Couchbase Lite does not have an authentication framework per se. Okay. So because of that, there's no SDK built in for this either. And so since this is the entry point of the application of validating the user has access to it, I had to build a new class called CB Lite app. And I had to kind of emulate the things that Realm was doing inside of that class, authenticating the user. Now, In my code, I went through and decided that since this is a very simple application, I wasn't going to go through and do complicated things. Instead, I was going to just use the REST endpoint from App Services to validate the user. I actually, for a simple application, this is perfectly fine. And this is the code that does it. So in CB Lite app, there's a login function here. You see it's a spend function. So this is going to use coroutines. And it's a very simple thing. It goes through and calls a REST endpoint, no different than when we did it earlier in the web browser in the previous video. We called it and validated that everything worked. This is all it's really doing is validating, hey, if it's a 401 or 403 or 404, any bad basically URL that comes back with a bad status code, we're gonna throw an error. If it's good, it's a 200, everything's puppies, kittens, and rainbows, then we go through and let the user into the application. Now, I recommend not doing this. I recommend getting security out of your application from the standpoint of right now, if you do this, and even if you're using Realms SDK, the problem is that the security of typing in the user and making sure that that password is out of memory is on you. And that's not necessarily something that's fun to deal with, right? From an InfoSec and security standpoint. So at Couchbase, we take a different approach to this. We recommend that you use a OpenID Connect framework, okay? And so OpenID Connect is a very cool open protocol for authenticating. And I'm in the docs right now, and I know this is gonna be really hard to find in the docs, so I'm gonna walk you through it. So from docs, you're gonna go to Capella. From Capella, you're gonna go into operational. And you're gonna scroll through this very long list until you get to administering Capella, and it's buried deep. In administering Capella, you're gonna find manage app services for mobile and edge. You're gonna find the application endpoint, and under that, you're gonna go to administer an endpoint. I'm almost there. And then finally, you're gonna go set up an application provider. Now, what this does is this allows you to add in a OpenID Connect based authentication provider. And there's many of them available. Obviously, the big ones are Ping from Ping Identity. You have Auth0 from Okta. Microsoft customers are going to love Entra, which is their rename of Azure AD. These are all wonderful identity providers. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, one, I'm going to give you the advantages of this, right? And this is my personal opinion, right? So these are my personal opinion, but you never want a password of memory in your application because it's just another problem you have to deal with. How do I get the password out of memory to keep this application clean? What happens if the user leaves their phone in a car, in a cab, for example, or Uber, and then somebody grabs that phone? It's still in memory because the application is still running. It's just in the background. They plug it into a computer. They basically use some trickery. In Android, this isn't hard to pull everything that's in memory and throw that out to a text file. And now I can go find that password. That's bad, right? And I've had to deal with this for years building mobile applications, and this is why I always prefer identity providers. Identity providers bring in an authentication framework. It will usually do a deep link into their application that does the authentication and then sends back a JWT token that you can then use to sign into Capella App Services from that token, right? And the theory with this would be is that they handle the hard things. They handle authentication. They give you multi-factor authentication. They're going to give you two-factor authentication with some kind of authenticator app, and they handle the security. You want to build awesome applications. You don't necessarily want to be keeping track of like security and all these other things. So in my opinion, you should set this up. For the sake of the demo, obviously I just use a REST endpoint. But once again, if you're doing this for real in production, highly consider getting yourself a OpenID Connect. And you're probably saying, well, Aaron, I know Auth0, but what's OpenID Connect? Okay, just real quickly here. This isn't a security video, right? But just understand that Auth0 is a authorization framework used to basically protect resources. OpenID Connect is an authentication protocol layer on top of that, and it used to handle the authentication process. So think of it like the OpenID Connect is the step up from Auth0. Auth0 is something that sits inside of that stack, but really it's OpenID Connect that's handling the entire process of it. Okay, hopefully that makes sense for you. And set these up. Like I said, there's many different providers you can use for this. The documentation is pretty great on this. There's a blog post on the Couchbase website. This goes through and explains the entire authentication process for it. My recommendation, this is how you handle security properly on your applications. It will get you a better user experience for your end users. And because of that, everybody's going to be happy. So let's go on to the next major thing that you have to think about if you're doing a conversion of the application. And that's obviously your model changes, okay? So I'm gonna go into domain, and this particular application, I happen to know that's where the model changes were happening at. And you'll see here, this is the item. And now in Mongo land, they have classes that have to inherit from certain things, right? We have the luxury of not having that. We're pretty much, we don't care, we're a document-based database. So because of that, in Kotlin specifically, we can use things like the data class, which is just a step up from a quality of life improvement. Gives you things like automatic, the constructor right here. I can just pass these things in, they're now properties. That's really kind of nice. I did make a data access object because when we query stuff from the database, we're going to get stuff back as individual items in our where clause. So this is just basically ability to unwrap that where clause and get the item back in a data object that I can still access the particular item from. So that is a data access object, and that's perfectly fine. Because I want to use the serialization library built into Kotlin, when I actually go through and get my data code, I'm going to go through and make sure that I go through and set up the classes being serializable, and that's going to be able to make it so that's marked with that attribute. And then just make sure that this is not removed from the compiler or the linker, really, because the linker is your enemy, right? Of removing things that you want. So keep just forces it from being removed from the linker when it actually builds. We're going to say, no matter what, we are using this thing. Please don't link it out. Don't be mean and do that to me. And sometimes this can be a problem. You may have to edit your ProGuard, your R8, your D8, all those kind of configuration things in Android. I expect if you're an Android developer, you know exactly what I'm talking about, and you've had to fight those wars before, just like me, and you know exactly what you need to do in order to keep this working. So now the equals function is going to be used to be able to compare when we do our delta changes, right? So when we look for a delta, we want to say, hey, is this item equal to the other item? And so when I calculate deltas, that is an important thing to have. Obviously, if you're going to override the equals function, you need to also provide a hash code. That's what equals going to use that, right? So this is my own custom hash, basically, which is just taking the fields I care about and doing a hash on each one of those. And then finally, a helper method that I really like is I added is this to do JSON. What this does is this just basically encodes this and turns it back into a string so I can quickly add it to a mutable document and save it into the database without having to do a bunch of work. So this is just, like I said, a little helper function, and you could even have it vice versa, right? You could have a a thing that just takes this and converts it even to like a document, mutable document if you want. I like serialization. I like to have separations of my concerns. I don't like to go that deep because that's an implementation. So that's the reason why I don't have a to mutable document in here. I want to separate those concerns out. I'm doing a data migration, right? I have to move from one database platform to another. This is already painful. Don't mix and match your database platform to your models. That's my recommendation, right? And I'm just saying that here, and let's be honest, right? That's going to make your app as clean as possible, which makes this conversion process easier. So keep your separations concerns, and life is going to be good. Which just make models, let's make them so that they could serialize if they need to, and then let the serialization library and our business logic handle how to serialize those into whatever we need to serialize those to in order to save into the database. Now, I talked about authentication earlier. There is no user object built into the Couchbase Lite SDK that's used to handle like this whole authentication process, right? So because I'm doing internal authentication, I did make this class called, it's a data class called user that basically makes it so that it can write to the authentication framework, and it can be handled by events, because this particular application, if we go back to the diagram here, which I didn't write, right? I just converted it. It is event-based driven application, and it does pass that user around to this go-to task. When that go-to task comes up, that's what brings up the main activity that loads in the ability to see all the lists of items and stuff. So because of that, I needed to make that look like the Mongo's user, so I wouldn't have to change all that code out. Once again, it's a conversion, right? So my goal is, how do I change out things in a way that I can minimize the amount of code I have to change out? So I did my model changes, right? And then the data access layer is the final part of this. And this is the hardest part, if you ask me. When I say hard, it wasn't hard. I'm going to be honest with you, right? It really wasn't all that difficult. The nice thing about this application is that they use the repository pattern. And the repository pattern is my recommendation pattern for Android developers. You should have separations of your data access layer. Repository is a great way to do this. And then from a repository, obviously, you're going to have your view model. So your view model is going to use that repository to get information. The view model then sends it to the UI, to the UI layer, right, via views. And that's because this application was written that way, it makes it pretty easy to convert, because all I had to do is make a new repository. It had an interface already predefined, right? The sync repository here. So for most of this, I didn't have to really change all that much on here. In fact, I even reused the subscription types, because really that's just a filter that says, should I query one query or another? So because of that, I was like, you know what? I'll keep the enum as subscription types. That's perfectly fine. I'm not going to change all that code out. even you'll see here results change. You're like, well, wait a minute, results change is a Mongo thing. Well, sort of. I'll get into that in a second, but I tried my best to keep the signature as close as I could to minimize the amount of code I'd have to change out. Yep. So you'll see here, I made a new repository from that interface, right? I'm gonna inherit from that, and this is gonna be my new Couchbase version. I have some things I need to keep track of in Couchbase land. All documents are stored inside of collections, right? And I have a single collection right now. We talked about that in a previous video, but if you didn't watch that video and you haven't read the doc, just understand that everything's in a collection called tasks. We have a database. In Couchbase Lite, we are a true database. We're not an object cache. So you're going to have a mobile database on this mobile device, this Android phone. There's actually two, because we logged in as a separate user. Every user in this code base gets its own database. And that was a decision that I made during the conversion process. Having shared databases, not necessarily a recommended approach. And quite honestly, there's a great blog article on the Couchbase website. If you go search for this for shared databases, and it'll go through and walk you kind of through that. But the idea is that you should have each user having its own database with its own unique information inside of it. And then you could technically have a third database that maybe is just shared information, right? But from a security standpoint, you really don't want to mix and match two people's information inside of the same database. It's just not recommended. So with that, I have a replicator. The replicator is going to handle all the replication between app services, Couchbase Capella, and this mobile app. I do have a query listener, and I also am keeping track of the status of what's going on with the application. In here, I have two queries. Now, this is something that most people don't know inside of Couchbase, is that a query is compiled. And so when you create a query, it compiles it down into a point where I wouldn't say it's bytecode, but it's pretty close to the point where we can use it efficiently in memory. Because of the fact that queries are compiled, my recommendation is that you cache the query compiled in memory so that you don't have to constantly recompile the query every single time you need to run it. And so because of that, I make a pointer here and I make a late init on it. When the database gets initialized, I'm going to also create those queries and cache them so that I don't have to query those every time. Because in the application itself, if we were to go take a look at this real quick, back here again, if I didn't cache these queries, every single time you hit the switch, it's going to make a new version of that query. And that's inefficient. If you do this over and over again, it'd be creating that new query in memory over and over again. And that's, like I said, it's going to chew up memory. It's going to make the garbage collector work harder than it needs to work. And honestly, there could be a delay in the application depending on how many times they click it back and forth, right? I don't want a delay. I want my application to be really, really fast, and I want it to be fluent. So because of that, I made the decision to do cache queries. They're not required, but they are a quality of life improvement if you care about performance. Now, I needed to keep track of changes, the deltas. And so that's why the previous items map exists, okay? Now there's two parts of initialization. The first part of initialization is saying, hey, look, no matter what, I'm going to set up some logging here, and I'm going to go through and make sure that the user's logged in. And if they're logged in, that's great. And if they're not logged in, then we got a problem, right? This repository should not be used until the user is logged in. And so we're going to gate that. We're going to say, hey, if the user is not logged in, we're going to give a legal state saying you can't do this right now. They're not logged in. That's to help us keep us from accidentally initializing a database and possibly giving a bad actor access to the database that they may have not provided the proper username and password to get access to. Once we do this, it's pretty basic. We're going to go through, I'm not going to go through every step of the process because this could be a very long video, but basically we're going to make a database. We make a configuration of the database. Then we go through and figure out the database name we want to use, and we calculate that based on the username logged in. Once we have the username logged in, we can parse that out and then make a database name for that so that it's unique per user logged into the application. We go through and create a collection. That's one thing that people don't understand is that the create collection call, if the collection already exists, it'll return the existing collection or it'll create it. So it's like an up insert in many ways, right? And that just as a quality of life improvement, you don't have to check if the collection already exists. Just call create collection no matter what. You're going to get the collection either way, regardless if it exists or not. Because we're doing queries and we're using SQL++, we should probably make an index. So I go through and make an index based on the owner ID field. That's just going to make when we run queries faster. Just a reminder, indexes can make your writes slower, right? If you're indexing things in memories, every time you write to the database, we have to update the index. So just understand that. I'm not saying don't create indexes. I'm just saying don't create a million of them. Make sure that the indexes you create count and are actually going to be used. Otherwise, you're just wasting resources and slowing things down. we have our replication configuration, and this is super complicated. I have the most basic replication configuration here, which I'm just going to go through because this is usually the thing that people struggle with the most to understand. Is we have our endpoint URL that came from our configuration file. We read that in. Then we go through and we set the type to push and pull. Push and pull simply means I'm going to be able to pull down new documents from app services, and I can push changes that I have locally up there. You can actually just pull new documents down without ever pushing, or you can push documents without ever pulling. Why would you want to do these kind of states? Well, an example, IoT application, you may only have sensor information that's collecting, like, let's say that it's collecting the temperature of a refrigerator in a restaurant. And all you ever do is update, hey, the refrigerator is at 34 degrees, whatever it is, right? Celsius or Fahrenheit. That's only writing. You never want to really, you're pushing up to app services, but you'd never, or to Sync Gateway, you'd never want to read new information because you're just an IoT device. So in there, you just push. That's all you ever need to do. Now, pull could be where this is just a read-only application that, maybe it's a dashboard application that just shows you information and the user never changes any documents. Well, there's no reason ever than to push any information, so then you'd set that to pull. Now, continuous means that it's going to constantly pull from app services on a scheduled time basis. And so you don't have to do anything. You just say continuous, and then when it needs to, it's going to go through, pull that information, and make sure that you always are up to date. So that's what continuous means. If you want to do a runtime replication and then get out of it, you absolutely could do this by changing continuous to be false. And you could do a one-time replication, for example, on that. Now, something new in Couchbase Lite 3.2 is we have collection support now, right? That happened in Couchbase Lite 3.1. And 3.2, you do need to make a collection configuration and pass your collection into that. Now, there is the configuration. If you don't need to filter documents or channels, which is something that we absolutely do support, then you could just pass in a blank collection configuration, which is what I do here. I say, here's a pointer to my collection, which is that task collection that we created earlier, or got the existing one from the database. And I just pass a blank configuration because I don't need to filter documents or channels. If you need to do that, you'd go into your collection config and do your updating that configuration and then send that into the replicator config. Obviously, I'm just doing basic username and password authentication here, so I'm just going to use basic authenticator, passing in that current user that I have stored in memory. Like I said, don't do this in production because that password will be in memory. I don't like that. Inside the garbage collector, it's super hard to get out because it's also a string in it, and that's not efficient. So use an OpenID connector. But for this particular application, we're just going to use basic authentication. We're going to set the replicator's authenticator to be this basic authentication object. And then the replicator, we're just going to create a new one. And then we can go through and do a listener on it. So what this is going to do is, if there's any errors, we can show them up on the screen of what's going on in our application. And that's all this listener does. Okay, that's it. Once we have a listener set so that we can get any errors that are kind of going on with replication, we can then start the replicator. And at that point in time, now the replicator started, we can start with, this has been initted, everything's cool. The last thing I want to do is create those cache queries so that I don't have to rebuild those queries every single time they run. And so that's what this does right here. It creates two SQL++ cache queries, and these are just basic SQL. And so it's pretty basic what these do. One's just showing all documents, one's showing them filtered where the owner ID is equal to the current logged in user. And that's it pretty much. So let's go through and just talk about real quickly the other functions. And then I'll give you a couple of hints of things that you may want to look at. And then we'll call it a day. All right, sound cool? So let's take a look here. For adding a function, or excuse me, adding a task is pretty basic. We pass in an object, right? And honestly, in this application, there's only one thing that you really added to a task, and that was how the original app worked, which was a string of the task name. So because of that, I don't need a full task object for this, right? I just need that string, and then I can make a new item from that, right? And I can, when I make that new item, I can set the username to whatever the current logged in user is. That's going to be the owner ID, right? And then we have our task summary, which is going to equal that summary that we pass in. And then really, this is pretty basic. Like I said earlier, we had the helper function that we added that makes it super easy to get the JSON string back for this. In Couchbase Lite, what we do is everything's based on mutable documents. If you want to save a document to the database, that's a mutation. And so that's going to be a mutable document. So I make a new mutable document. Now, each document, just like in Realm, has to have a unique ID, and we call that a document ID. Inside of here, I'm just going to use the ID field from the task itself, and that's a UUID, as my document ID. And then I'm just going to pass in the JSON string and the mutable document. Since we're a JSON-based database, we'll take that JSON string and automatically make the mutable document for us. And then all we have to do is save it. It's that simple. So in summary, to add a new document into the database, it's pretty basic. Get yourself an object, right? Whatever object you want, serialize it down to a string, go through and add it with a document ID and then that JSON string, and you can save it. And that's one way to do it. Obviously, there's multiple ways to do this. You could take the mutable document and manually add in the fields. So for example, I could say mutable document, is that mutable doc, and I could say set string, and I can set it this way also. That's a perfectly valid way to also do it. I'm using JSON serialization because most people that have Realm are going to be having business objects, and you're going to want to have business objects versus doing mapping. This is what I normally call mapping code. You're mapping an object to another object. And this can get tedious if the object has many fields, right? If it has like 30 fields inside of it or 30 properties, that is tedious, right? And that code can get kind of wieldy. In the world of schemaless, what happens if you add a field? Now you have to remember to go add the mapping code in, right? All those kind of reasons are the reasons why I prefer serialization. Now to remember, serialization comes at a cost, right? And anybody can tell you from a performance standpoint, if you're using the serialization library, you're going to take a small hit for that serialization to happen. They basically take that object, put it into a string, then make it so that we could take it and put it into the mutable document. All that comes at a small hit of performance. If you want pure performance and you're worried about doing massive amounts of writes at once, you may want to think about having mapping code instead. That's going to probably be a little bit more performant. You should probably test that though based on your objects and your data to validate which one works for you. For my sake of simplicity, I'm going to use serialization. I'm guessing most developers will probably agree with me. That's in the modern day of phones running as fast as laptops, that's more than enough. The close function is used when the person logs out. It basically just closes things and makes sure that everything's done. The delete task is pretty basic. We take the object in, right? And that's when somebody were to go to the ellipsis and click the delete option, right? What we're going to do here, though, is that really all we have to do is validate the document exists. So we're going to go through and get that document, right? If we got the document, we can delete it, right? Then we're going to make sure that you are the owner of that document. And this is a second layer of security, right? App services endpoint, we already have a required user on that particular field that we did in our function earlier, right? And we did that in the, if you missed that, go check out the other video on how to set up app services where I explain how the sync function works. But basically that already is making sure that you can't change something you don't own. But this is another layer of security, basically inside the application itself, validated that, hey, if you're not the owner of this document, don't allow them to delete it, right? And then we can go through and actually delete the document. If you are not, the owner of it, then we go through, and it's pretty basic. We just take the document that we got from the database and we call the delete from the collection, and that will remove the document. When that happens, replication will automatically push that change up, which would then remove it, okay? I'm gonna go and I'm gonna skip get task, we'll do that last. Okay, let's go to and look at toggle is complete. And that's when somebody clicks a checkbox, right? And it's almost the same thing as the delete. We get a task in, right? We're gonna go through and validate we have that document. If we have the document, we're gonna validate we're the owner of it. Now the difference is that we need to change the state of that field inside of it, right? And this is where it doesn't make sense to serialize because we're only changing one field. Quite honestly, it's like, well, why wouldn't I just get the document back from the database and change that one field? And so you can see that's what we do here, right? We're gonna go through, get the document from the collection, validate that we have the document using nullables inside of Kotlin's awesome framework for doing this. If we are the owner of it, we're gonna go through and calculate that it's completed by first getting the current value and then changing it. So we'll see here, we get the document from the database, okay? And then we're gonna change it to a mutable document because by default, when you get a document from the database, it's not mutable. So you can call the documents to mutable function to convert a document from the database that you get to a mutable so you can make changes to it. Once I do that, I'm going to then just change that field to be whatever it's the opposite of what it currently is. And that's what the not field does, right? We're gonna do, if it's certainly set to true, this will set it to false. Currently false, it set it to true, and then we save it. This is far more efficient than taking the task and serializing the entire task when really only one field has changed and you know one field has changed. And this is just an efficiencies of understanding like your data, what your application is doing, and making the logical decision. When it came to add, it made sense that we use serialization. When we're going to toggle or update the document, it doesn't make sense because only a single field is being updated. In there then, serialization is not the right answer to it. We should just use key value by updating the document itself in that single field inside of that mutable document. And that's how we want to do it. So the last thing to talk about here that I want to go into is talking about the most complicated part of this application change. And that is to understand how query works with live query. So what live query is a subscription-based system where basically it's a flow. And I highly recommend, if you don't understand Kotlin coroutines and flows, then this video ain't gonna help you. You need to go understand those first before even understanding anything I say. But basically what ends up happening is live query will give you a flow of changes any single time anything in the query changes. So for example, if I were to add one new document, that query would change because you have a new document available. Now, how live query works inside of Couchbase Lite is that we give you all the changes. We just run the query again and give you the full entire results of that query run. So every single time you're getting a new run of the flow, you're getting all the documents. That's not how Realm works. How Realm works is it gives you a delta. A calculation is called a results change, okay? The results change gives you two deltas. It gives you the inserts, and then it gives you separately the update. Or first, let me step back for a second. I spoke wrong. It gives you two different types of deltas. It gives you, is this the initial load? If this is the initial load, it'll give you all the documents you need, or all the objects you need, right? And then if it's not the initial load, then it will give you the deltas of updates, deletes, and inserts. And those three things in a single data set, right? Now, I didn't want to change this application out from that data because that, honestly, that animation, like I showed you earlier, is pretty cool. So how do we do that then? Well, my answer was I just looked at the Realm SDK to figure out what that signature was for the results change. And I made my own version of it that's very similar to theirs. It's not the full API, but it's enough to get me back. So I made an interface called results change. I went through and made an initial results just like their SDK does with, and then also saying, hey, look, this is going to implement results change, right? With the type T. And inside of here, this is our initial list of results if this is initial load. And if it's a delta change, right, we're gonna have the inserts, deletes, and changes. And these is the exact same similar signature that Realm used. Well, because these match the same signature, all I had to do then is change the import out. And by theory, most of their code should work the same. And that's a goal. In the view model, I shouldn't have to change a lot of this code because the delta, it's the same delta, right? So you'll see here that how this works is we make a new flow. And this is the most important thing here. Because this is a flow, I can run a map on it. And anytime the query changes, I can just say, hey, map my query change. And this is where I'm gonna do my serialization of my objects inside of this map, okay? So every single time this flow runs, we're gonna get the query change. That's gonna come back as a query change. And then this query change, I'm gonna loop through that query change and calculate the deltas. And that's what this map query change item function does. It's gonna give you back a results change. That's not a Couchbase Lite object. That's the one I created earlier that I just showed you, right? So that's what we're gonna return back. By doing this, once again, like I said, the view model code, hardly nothing has a change, and the views, no code has a change whatsoever, because we're just giving it in the same shape and format that originally the application wanted it in, because this is a conversion, right? We're trying to make it as easy as possible. You'll see here, I go through and make that empty. I go through and set all my collections I need to keep track of. I'm not gonna go through all this code. You can read it. It's in, if you understand Kotlin, it's pretty basic. But basically inside of here, what I do wanna get at is I'm using that data access object, right? Because the query is going to always give you back each row as an individual item. And so I'm going to use the data access item to get that individual item and then serialize it to an actual physical item. And then I go through, add it in, calculate whether or not it's an insert or is this a change. If it's a change, I need to calculate whether or not it was updated, or if it's a change, or if it was deleted, right? And once I do that, I get my results set here, making sure that I have it all cleared and everything's set and I know my deltas are right. And I say, hey, if it's initial data, send the initial, otherwise send the delta. And by doing that, this, like I said, literally emulates the entire Realm SDK and how it worked with its result change with bringing Couchbase Lite in without having to make massive amounts of changes to the UI and to the view models in order to kind of go through and get this application working. And this quite honestly was the thing that the brunt of the work of this application was getting this working in a way that I didn't have to rewrite my view models. And I also had the coolness of, hey, if I change a field, it only updates the actual physical field instead of that object, instead of updating the entire list, which is, like I said, in some applications, you just can't have that. So that is basically the conversion process when it comes down to it. That's what I changed. Now you can do deltas. You can go look at the old code, no code, if you want to see a full set of that. I want to leave you with like how do I, what are some tips that I can give you? One of my biggest tips I can give you is that the data is always stored on the mobile device. And if you want to kind of see what's going on from that standpoint, Android Studio has ability for you to see the physical device and all the files on it. Okay. And that's just built into Android Studio itself, right? Now, if you want to pull the data off the physical device and then look at it, we have a cool plugin for Android Studio. So this is a Android Studio extension because Android Studio is based on the JetBrains IDEs. And you can go through and go to Android Studio and go to settings. And from settings, you can find your, let's see here, where's your extensions? One second here. Plugins, extensions, almost same thing, right? And in the marketplace, you can just search for Couchbase, okay? And if you get the Couchbase extension installed, I already have it installed, what you could do is you can open Couchbase-like databases from inside of it. What? Yeah, that's pretty cool. Right here, I'm just gonna click this Couchbase icon. This is where I happen to have the extension installed. You see here, here's a CB Lite. And the cool thing is you can open up a database or create a new database. And once you do that, you can kind of go through and connect to it. And then you can go through and see all the scopes and collections. If you want to make a new collection, you can make a new collection. You can query the data, see what's going on. You can import and export data out of it. This extension is super cool. And for me, when I'm trying to test to see what's going on, I can't tell you how, this is just one of the coolest things that I use on a daily basis. When I'm doing mobile development with mobile databases, the ability to kind of get into that data, take a look at it, is priceless. The other thing I'd say is that, make sure you fully read the documentation. And I'm going to give you a couple other hints here. So one, the Couchbase Lite documentation here for Android is really great. If you go into queries, you're going to get into live query over here. And this is going to give you a good set of documentation to explain live queries outside of my very basic explanation. There's a troubleshooting section here that will go through, and troubleshooting queries will give you some help there. How to use logs properly is a really great thing also to understand here, right? Understanding data conflicts when you get into complicated replication configuration, I highly recommend reading this documentation to have an understanding how it works. Finally, in the documentations, I highly recommend reading the understanding of the control access and validation. Okay? Understanding what this is and how this works. You want to read through all the documentation to understand the entire sync process. So you want to go through the app services documentation on the Capella documentation here on the site and make sure you understand all the parts of those. Now, the good news is in this repo, I give you all this inside the README. So if you go look at the README here, you're going to see here that as you go through and look at this documentation, I'm going to give you links to all the kind of things here. Everything that's blue is a link that I'm going to give you links directly to things. And so as you kind of go through the replication, I tell you, hey, you should look at the Kotlin SDK for this. Inside of this document over here, I'm going to say, hey, here's the required user documentation that explains how that works. Here's how the resolution conflict, I kind of showed you that over there, that link there. But all these kind of things, I'm going to always give you the documentation. So here's the documentation for channels and roles. So if I were to open these up, and here is our roles documentation that explains how roles work. And then here is my channels documentation that explains that. So the nice thing is that you don't have to dig through the documentation. If you read the code, the README file here, and you go through it, you're going to find that I have links to all the things that you're going to actually care about in the migration process. Now, of course, I want to leave you with this. Hey, look, this is a to-do app, right? We're all developers. Let's just be honest, right? This is a pretty basic application. Your application is probably going to be way more complicated than this, right? And so it's going to not be as easy as what I did. And that's perfectly understandable, right? My goal wasn't to tell you every single trick. It was to get you started, right? This is a good starting point to understand the key differences between the two SDKs. When it comes down to it, Realm is almost like an ORM or like a object cache, right? We are a true mobile database, and we are a true document-based database. We like JSON, right? And so because of that, you're going to have some advantages if you understand that. If you've built applications that maybe serialized from a REST API, that's going to feel really at home. But the beauty is you'll never have to call REST API again, right? That's really kind of nice. But if you have an application that has 30 screens and stuff like that, you may have 10 repositories in your code that you're going to have to change out, and that's perfectly understandable, right? Once again, like I said, this isn't a complete guide. This is just simply to help you get you started. So I really want to thank you for watching through the entire video. I know it's long, but it's a complicated conversation to have with people. If you have any questions or stuff like that, please hit us up over on the forums, Couchbase forums. More than happy to talk to you over there. We also have a Discord, and you can hit us up over there and ask questions in the mobile channel. Other than that, I really want to thank you for once again watching the video, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care.